There is a particular kind of suspicion that only serious investigators develop. It is not the suspicion that comes from finding contradictions. Contradictions are normal. Every historical event, every document, every human account contains them in some form. Experienced researchers expect them. They account for them. They build around them. The suspicion that should alarm you is different. It arrives not when a story has too many cracks, but when it has none. When the account is too smooth, too consistent, too complete. When every question has an answer, and every answer connects cleanly to the next. That kind of perfection does not occur naturally. It is constructed. And when a story has been constructed to look perfect, the first task of anyone who takes truth seriously is to find what was cut out. The official version of Yuri Gagarin's flight into space fits perfectly into a school textbook. One man, one ship, one orbit, one triumphant radio transmission, one safe landing. The hero returns alive. The country erupts in celebrations. The world applauds. Clean, linear, complete, too clean. Our investigation does not begin at the launch pad in Baikonur. It begins in a dim corridor of a closed archive, where the air carries the specific, unmistakable smell of dust and old fear. Somewhere between identical metal shelves and identical grey folders, there is a file that is almost invisible. Almost. It is marked in careful bureaucratic handwriting of special importance. Inside, interrogation protocols, medical conclusions, technical notes, fragments of radio transcripts, and short, nervous handwritten comments in the margins. The kind of comments people write when they want to record something without being fully responsible for having written it. Between the stamps and the signatures, you can see the omissions, the crossed-out phrases, the references to pages that are no longer there. It is in those gaps, in those absences, that the outline of a different story begins to appear. A story that was never read from any tribune. On the surface, nothing in the primary record contradicts the official version. In April of the early 1960s, the Soviet Union launches the first human being into space and wins a decisive ideological victory over the West. The flight is short, the trajectory is calculated to the meter. Every phrase Gagarin spoke on the air has been rehearsed. Every step of the flight plan is fixed in documentation and propaganda. The hero returns. The celebrations are real. The world's admiration is genuine. But if you look at the primary materials, the drafts, the internal memoranda, the closed reports that were never meant for public consumption, the smooth film begins to tremble. There are strange pauses in the radio log, gaps described later as loss of signal. To the public, this is a technical inconvenience, a routine imperfection of early space communication. But in internal notes from that period, those same gaps are referenced in ways that suggest something other than technical failure. There are phrases cited in those notes that never appear in any published transcript. There are medical observations, written in the careful, deflecting language of Soviet institutional documentation, that do not quite fit the image of a calm, unshaken pilot who saw nothing unusual during his 90 minutes above the Earth. What if the empty minutes are not the margins of the story? What if they are the center of it? Later, when the first wave of euphoria had passed, a small number of people who had worked around Gagarin began to remember details that they had learned, very quickly, not to discuss. A doctor who noticed a new quality of tension in Gagarin's eyes in the hours after the flight. Not exhaustion, not disorientation, something else. Something the doctor did not have a clinical category for, and so recorded in language that was technically accurate and practically meaningless. A communications officer who, in a private conversation many years later, let slip a reference to 20 strange minutes over South America. He said it once. He did not say it again. A security officer who mentioned, in an unguarded moment, an unusually rigid secrecy protocol imposed around a mission that had officially been described as straightforward, planned, and fully controlled. None of these people had the full picture. Each saw only their own fragment, and almost all of them learned at some point to push that fragment into the darkest corner of their memory and leave it there. In the Soviet system, curiosity was not rewarded, especially not when it concerned the first and most celebrated icon of the space age. There is a second entrance to this mystery. It lies 7 years after the flight. In late March of the late 1960s, the first man in space dies in what is officially described as a training accident. A routine flight, a difficult maneuver, a loss of orientation, an impact with the ground. The investigation provides the public with a logical chain of causes. The media wraps it in appropriate mourning. The case is closed. But on the edges of that neat official diagram, the same pattern appears again. Witnesses in the areas near the crash site describe a bright object in the sky shortly before the impact, something that did not resemble any conventional aircraft or meteorological device. Some reports mention unusual burn patterns on fragments of the wreckage. Others reference radiation readings slightly above normal background levels, quickly attributed to instrument error. Scorch marks on nearby trees that do not correspond cleanly to the angle of descent the official reconstruction requires. Each detail taken individually is explicable. Together they form a pattern that does not resolve. Between the first flight and the final crash, one question grows steadily, like a crack spreading under a fresh coat of paint. What exactly did Yuri Gagarin see during those minutes above the dark curve of South America, when no other human being on Earth could look out the same window? This is our central question. It is simple in its formulation and genuinely dangerous in its implications. Because if what he saw was something the official version could not accommodate, then everything that followed, every parade, every speech, every carefully managed public appearance, every decision that kept him away from real space missions for the remaining years of his life, takes on a different meaning. This is not an attempt to rewrite established historical facts. It is an attempt to reconstruct the layer of history that sits directly underneath them. The layer that exists at the intersection of classified documents, suppressed personal testimonies, and the kind of inexplicable coincidences that accumulate around events where someone, at some point, decided that the truth was too complicated to share. We will follow Yuri Gagarin from a village under occupation, through a childhood that forged qualities no training program could have designed, into the brutal selection that identified him as the one person best suited to go first, and then into those 90 minutes that split his world permanently in two. Our investigation begins, as all serious investigations do, with the question that official accounts make the least effort to answer. What did he see? And what did seeing it cost him? Before the rockets, there was the mud. Before the smile that appeared on the front pages of every newspaper in the world, before the parades and the handshakes with heads of state, before the name that children in countries that had never spoken Russian learned to pronounce, there was a boy in a village under occupation who had already learned the most fundamental lesson that human experience can teach: that the world does not owe you safety. Yuri Gagarin was born on the 9th of March 1934 in the village of Klushino, a small settlement in the Smolensk region of Russia, roughly 150 kilometers west of Moscow. His father was a carpenter. His mother worked on the collective farm. It was a life measured in the rhythms of rural Soviet poverty. Not exceptional, not tragic in any particular way, until the war arrived and made it both. He was 7 years old when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. What that meant concretely for a child in a village like Klushino was not a series of historical events that could later be organized into dates and operations. It was empty shelves. It was burned buildings whose smoke drifted for days across the fields. It was the particular silence of adults who had stopped trying to hide their fear from their children because there was no longer any point. It was watching grown men bow their heads to people who wore different uniforms and spoke in a foreign language. For a child, that kind of fear does not stay outside. It moves in. It becomes part of the way you read situations, the way you assess danger, the way you calculate what you can say and to whom and in what tone. It becomes, as psychologists would put it much later in language, that strips the experience of everything that makes it real, a coping mechanism. The people who knew Gagarin as an adult would later remark on his composure, his ability to remain functional under extreme pressure, his tendency to become calmer, more precise, more focused, exactly when the situation demanded the opposite. Medical evaluations conducted during his cosmonaut selection would describe him in the dry language of institutional psychology as calm, balanced, capable of rapid adaptation to non-standard situations. What those evaluations did not record was where that composure came from. It came from a childhood in which fear was not a theoretical stress test. It was Tuesday. Yet the war did something else alongside the damage it caused, something paradoxical. The bombers that flew over the village left fire and death behind them, but they also planted something in the imagination of the boy watching from below. The fact that a human being could climb that high, could command a machine that moved through the upper air with such speed and certainty, could be, from that altitude, entirely beyond the reach of whatever held you down on the ground. On the ground, you could be searched, you could be humiliated, you could have things taken from you by people with guns and uniforms who had decided, entirely without consulting you, that they had the right to do so. Up there, at least in the way a child's mind processes these things, you were unreachable. That contrast, absolute powerlessness on the surface, absolute freedom in the air, would stay with Gagarin for the rest of his life. It was not just the romantic appeal of flight, it was something more fundamental. A conviction formed in the specific crucible of wartime childhood that the sky was the one place where the rules that had been imposed on the ground did not apply. When the war ended and the country turned its exhaustion toward the obsessive project of rebuilding, young Gagarin found that the state's ambitions and his private direction had suddenly aligned. Aviation was everywhere. It was in the propaganda posters and the school textbooks and the speeches. It was the symbol of Soviet technological ambition and national restoration. For a boy who had spent years watching the sky with a feeling he could not yet name, it was as if the entire machinery of the state had swung around to point in the same direction he was already facing. He joined a local flying club. The first time he climbed into a training cockpit, the world outside compressed itself into metal, instruments, and the horizon visible through the windscreen above the airfield. The smell of engine oil and aviation fuel. The vibration of the fuselage when the engine turned over. A particular quality of silence inside his own mind that he had never found on the ground. For the first time in his life, he was not reacting to forces that had been imposed on him. He was the one moving the controls, deciding the angle of ascent, the rate of turn, the moment and direction of the landing. His instructors noticed something immediately. This quiet young man with the uncomplicated smile behaved differently under stress than every other student they had taught. Where others tightened and overcorrected, he seemed to relax. Where others reacted to unexpected situations with visible panic, he absorbed them, processed them, and responded with a measured precision that should not have been present at his level of experience. It was not the manufactured confidence of someone trying to impress. It was something more dependable and harder to explain. A quality of internal calibration that allowed him to continue functioning clearly at the exact point where the situation was pushing most people toward the edge of their capacity. From the flying club, he moved to military aviation school, then to airfields near the Arctic Circle, where he flew in conditions of extreme cold and sudden weather, and the permanent awareness that rescue, if something went wrong, might not come at all. Each environment was another filter. Each one revealed the same pattern. Under pressure, he did not degrade. He sharpened. But there was another side to Gagarin that did not appear in medical reports or instructor evaluations. It emerged in the rare, relaxed moments after a shift, when the professional formality lifted slightly and the pilots sat over tea in the mess hall and allowed themselves to talk about something other than systems and procedures and flight paths. When the conversation turned to what might exist beyond the atmosphere, most of his colleagues responded in two predictable ways. They made jokes, or they repeated the approved language about the triumph of Soviet science and the inevitable conquest of the cosmos by human technology. Gagarin asked different questions, not philosophical in the abstract sense, but specific, almost technical. What would a person actually feel when the Earth stopped filling the entire window? How would the mind respond to the complete absence of a familiar horizon? Would human consciousness expand or fracture when it understood, at the level of direct physical experience, rather than intellectual knowledge, that the planet it had always known as the entire world was actually a small ball in an incomprehensibly larger darkness? These were not the questions of someone romanticizing space travel. They sounded, to anyone paying close attention, like the questions of someone instinctively preparing themselves for an encounter that no existing manual had yet described. Whether Gagarin himself understood what he was preparing for, no document records. What the documents do record, in the evaluations and psychological profiles and selection committee notes that accumulated around his name through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, is the consistent and growing sense among those responsible for the selection that this particular man was made for something that went beyond ordinary pilot performance. What exactly that something was, no one said directly, not yet. When the Soviet leadership decided to move from high-altitude aircraft to actual human spaceflight, the selection process that followed was described publicly as a search for the finest physical specimens in the Soviet military aviation system. That description was accurate as far as it went. It did not go very far. The official criteria was straightforward enough. Candidates needed to be healthy, physically near perfect, psychologically stable, and politically unimpeachable. They needed fast reaction times and good performance under physical stress. They needed biographies that contained nothing that could be used against them, or, more precisely, against the state that was about to attach its most visible achievement to their name. These were the criteria that appeared in the documentation. Behind the documentation, a different set of requirements was also being applied. One that was harder to specify on paper, precisely because it described something that the people doing the selecting could recognize, but could not entirely explain. They needed people whose minds would not come apart when they encountered something genuinely, absolutely new. Not unfamiliar, not difficult. Genuinely new. The kind of new that has no category in existing experience, that the brain cannot process through analogy or prior preparation, because no analogy exists and no prior preparation is possible. They needed people who could experience something extraordinary and still say the correct, approved phrases into the microphone. People who could hold two realities at once, what they were experiencing and what they were permitted to report, without the gap between them becoming unmanageable. This was a rarer combination than physical fitness, considerably rarer. Gagarin entered the selection as one among many. His early results were unexceptional, numbers in a long table, pulse, blood pressure, reaction times, performance under various standardized loads. Then the tests became more complex. The centrifuge simulations, designed to reproduce the crushing physical forces of launch and re-entry, produced results that began to distinguish his file from the others. His body tolerated the loads exceptionally well. That part was measurable and noted. But what the evaluating physicians observed beyond the physical data was something different and harder to quantify. Most candidates, as the overloads increased and the physical strain approached the boundary of what the human body is built to withstand, showed the same pattern in their cognitive performance. The numbers slipped, decision times lengthened, the quality of responses under pressure degraded in ways that were predictable, understandable, and entirely human. Gagarin's cognitive performance, at the point where others were losing clarity, remained stable. Not heroically stable, not dramatically stable in a way that called attention to itself, simply stable in the quiet, reliable way of a system that had learned very early in its development to continue functioning regardless of what the external environment was doing. The evaluations recorded this in dry clinical language that gave no indication of how unusual it actually was. Then came the isolation experiments. Soundproof chambers, candidates left alone for hours or days with minimal sensory input. No reliable time markers. No social contact. No environmental cues of any kind. The goal, stated in technical language, was to assess the response of the human mind when stripped of the ordinary scaffolding that normally supports it. The results across the candidate group ranged from manageable to severe. Disorientation was common, anxiety was common. Auditory and visual phenomena, the mind generating its own input when none was available from outside, were common enough to be expected and accounted for in the evaluation protocols. Then there was Gagarin. The story of what happened during one of his sensory deprivation sessions never made it into any official publication. It circulated afterward among the people who had been present in the particular way that things circulate when they cannot be written down and yet cannot quite be forgotten. The monitoring equipment showed that he had moved into a state that the observing physicians could not immediately classify. His eyes were open. His posture was unremarkable. There were no visible signs of distress, but the pattern of his brain activity, as registered by the instruments attached to him, resembled the pattern of a person who was deeply asleep. When the observers finally ended the session and opened the chamber, Gagarin looked at the people standing in the doorway and said, in a perfectly level voice, 3 ordinary words. "I see you." The words themselves were unremarkable. People emerging from sensory deprivation sessions said all kinds of things. The evaluators had heard stranger. But the way he said it unsettled them in a way they found difficult to articulate afterward. It did not sound like a man returning from a nap. It did not sound like someone orienting himself after disorientation. It sounded like someone marking a transition, noting that one layer of reality had given way to another and that he had observed the shift. A separate note in his file flagged another phenomenon, the ability to sleep with his eyes open. Rare enough, the note said, to be worth recording, suggesting, the note did not quite say but clearly implied, that his mind might be capable of maintaining an outwardly functional state while directing a significant portion of its awareness somewhere else entirely. No one, at least in any document that has since become accessible, stated directly what this might mean for a mind exposed to the genuinely unfamiliar emptiness of orbital flight. The observation was recorded. The implication was left unspoken. As the selection narrowed, the description of Gagarin within the program changed. He was no longer simply a promising candidate. He had become, in the informal language that circulates in any institution when official language proves inadequate, made for space. Not because of any single metric or any single test result, because of the specific, unusual combination of what he was. Resilience built in a childhood where fear was daily routine. Composure forged in conditions where concealing your inner state was a survival skill. Curiosity that had been sharpened rather than blunted by military discipline. And a mind that, when stripped of everything familiar, did not fracture. His file was almost painfully clean. No compromising relatives, no ideological irregularities, no moments of visible doubt about the narrative he would be required to carry. His life story could be, and later would be, assembled into a textbook myth with very little editing required. That too was part of the calculation. In the final days before the launch, a series of meetings took place that did not appear on any official schedule. Small rooms, half-closed blinds, the light slightly too bright for comfort. Men who sat across from Gagarin and introduced themselves not by name and not by rank, but by function, guardians of state security. Their questions had nothing to do with cockpit procedures or orbital mechanics or emergency protocols. They were questions about loyalty, about discipline, about the relationship between personal experience and institutional obligation. They reminded him, with the particular courtesy that institutions use when they are making something clear that they do not want to appear to be making clear, that everything he would experience above the earth, everything he would say into the microphone, everything he would later describe in debriefings, was classified as a matter of national importance. The words they used included state secret, special regime, personal responsibility before the party and the people. Between the lines, the message had a simpler form. Your eyes belong to us now. For a man who had spent his entire adult life inside a system that considered itself entitled to define what was real, this was not a surprise. He understood what the flight represented politically. He had understood it for months. But sitting in that room, in the last days before he became the first human being to leave the planet, he felt something he had not anticipated. Not the weight of representing his country, he had been carrying that for a long time. The weight of being the only person who would ever know what it was like to be up there for the first time. And the simultaneous knowledge that whatever he found, whatever the darkness beyond the atmosphere showed him, only a carefully selected fragment of it would ever be permitted to travel in the other direction. The witness was being bound before the testimony had been given. Whatever he was about to see, he was already, in some essential sense, not free to tell. There is a moment in the launch sequence when theatre ends and physics begins. Up to that point, the rehearsed phrases, the cameras, the carefully managed ceremony of the departure, everything has the quality of a performance. A very serious one, with very high stakes, but a performance nonetheless. The words are prepared, the gestures are understood. The meaning of the event has been decided in advance by people sitting in rooms far from the launch pad. Then the engines ignite, and the weight on the chest begins. Not metaphorical weight, actual, physical, indifferent force pressing a human body into a seat with a persistence that has nothing to do with ideology or symbolism or the narrative requirements of a superpower's propaganda apparatus. The rocket does not care what the flight represents. The acceleration is the same for a hero and for anyone else strapped into the same position. Yuri Gagarin felt that weight on the morning of the 12th of April, 1961, as the Vostok spacecraft climbed through the layers of the atmosphere, through cloud and turbulence and the thinning air of the upper reaches, and finally beyond it. The voices of ground controllers in his headset maintained the rhythm of procedure. Numbers, altitude, velocity, trajectory. Each call and response had been rehearsed enough times that it had acquired the quality of something memorized rather than spoken. Familiar, almost calming. Then the engines cut, and the weight disappeared. The sensation that followed was unlike anything training had actually prepared him for, despite the training's best efforts. The centrifuge simulations, the parabolic flight arcs, the physical conditioning, all of it had approximated the experience of weightlessness in the way that a description of the ocean approximates the experience of standing in it. Technically accurate, fundamentally incomplete. The planet that had always been below was simply there, floating in absolute darkness. A glowing disk with a blue curve that he had seen in photographs, but that no photograph had ever quite rendered correctly, because the thing photographs cannot capture is the feeling of it, the combination of extraordinary beauty and profound wrongness that comes from seeing something you have always known as the entire world become suddenly, obviously, a small object in an incomprehensibly larger space. He reported what he was supposed to report. The words about the beauty of the earth, transmitted into his microphone and received by ground control, and later published and quoted and played over triumphant orchestral music in documentaries for decades. Those words were true. The view was breathtaking. The experience was overwhelming in exactly the way the words suggested. But even as he spoke them, something else was running beneath the surface. A question that had been forming in him since boyhood, through the war and the flying club and the Arctic airfields and the sensory deprivation chambers. The question he had been asking in various forms for years without being able to name it precisely, sharpened suddenly into something almost physical. If humanity has managed finally to send one of its own into this darkness, what if something else got here first? The official radio log of the flight records a period of communication interruption as Vostok passed over the southern hemisphere. The public explanation, then and since, is straightforward. The coverage of Soviet ground stations was imperfect in the early years of the space program. The angles of transmission and the limits of the technology produced gaps. This particular gap over the dark curve of South America is described as a routine technical inconvenience. In the leaked accounts, in the whispered recollections of people who saw raw data that was later edited, in the secondary references that surface in documents not intended to discuss this subject directly, what happened during those minutes sounds different. It began, in those accounts, not with a sound, not with any visible event. It began with a feeling. Pilots who fly in formation know a specific sensation that has no purely visual cause. The body registers the proximity of another large moving mass before the eyes have confirmed it. Something in the physical awareness of the flight environment shifts. Gagarin knew the sensation intimately. He felt it now. He turned toward the window. There, in the region where the darkness of space met the faint, luminous boundary of the atmosphere, he saw them. 3 objects, moving parallel to his trajectory, matching his speed with a precision that no known physical process produces accidentally. They were enormous by any scale his experience provided, though distant enough that their exact dimensions were impossible to judge. They did not flash like meteors. They did not drift like debris. They held formation with a consistency that was, in the most literal sense of the word, deliberate. Each one glowed faintly from within. Not reflected light. Not the way metal catches sunlight. Something that came from inside the object itself, as if the material it was made of and the light it produced were not 2 separate things. His pilot's training drove him immediately toward categorization. Aircraft, satellites, optical effect from the window's surface, instrument anomaly. None of the categories fit. He spoke. His voice was controlled. The training held. What ground control received, according to the reconstruction that would never appear in any official transcript, was a description of 3 large objects maintaining parallel formation with the spacecraft. He noted their stability, their synchronized movement. He reported the strong, specific impression of being observed, and then, searching for language that no instruction manual had ever prepared him to use, he said a phrase that would later become the hidden center of the entire suppressed account. "It is alive." From ground control, the response came fast and urgent and layered. Engineers asked about the instruments. Physicians asked about his vision. Someone, in a less formal channel, asked about his psychological state. The possibility of optical illusions generated by the capsule window was raised. The possibility of stress-induced visual phenomena was noted. The objects did not behave like illusions. Illusions do not hold precise formation for extended periods. Illusions do not shift slowly and deliberately, as if repositioning to examine a subject from a different angle. Illusions do not intensify their internal illumination at what appear to be moments of sustained, direct attention. The objects did all of these things. Then, as gradually as they had appeared, they began to withdraw. Not abruptly, the way something breaks off a pursuit, with the unhurried, considered deliberateness of observers who have gathered what they came for and have no particular urgency about departure. They faded into the black until they were indistinguishable from the stars. Communication resumed its normal pattern. Gagarin continued the flight. He reported systems data. He followed procedures. Outwardly, the mission unfolded exactly as planned. Inside, something had shifted that would not shift back. But the flight was not finished. Near the end of the orbit, in the final minutes before the re-entry sequence began, a second event occurred that some accounts describe as even harder to articulate than the sighting of the three objects. It began with light. Not a point of light in the darkness, a field. A curtain of brightness that seemed to form not in front of the capsule, but around it, as if the space itself had become luminous from a source that had no location. For a moment, the instruments were unreadable. His spatial orientation dissolved into white. Then, within the flood of light, something structured became visible. He saw the Earth from a distance that could not correspond to his actual orbit. It appeared suspended in a lattice of fine, luminous lines that crossed and connected in patterns that resembled no map or grid he had ever encountered. At the nodes of this lattice, points of light pulsed in rhythms that seemed, though he could not have explained why, attentive. From deeper within the field of light, something larger made itself present. He could not describe its shape because it did not have one in any sense his vocabulary contained. It was present the way that awareness is present, not as an object, but as the fact of being observed by something that has chosen, at this particular moment, to be observable. It was vast in a way that made scale irrelevant. It attended to him the way a mind attends to something it finds worth attending to. And with that attention came understanding. Not words, not language. Something that moved through the usual channels of speech and arrived already assembled, as if it had always been waiting in a space that words normally occupy. The understanding that what he was looking at was not exceptional, that it was always there, that humanity had been observed for longer than humanity had been capable of observing, that the flight he was on, the extraordinary, unprecedented, politically momentous flight that was going to make him the most famous person on the planet, was, from a certain perspective, a very small first step. Then the light diminished. The web of lines faded. The presence withdrew to wherever presence withdraws to. The cockpit returned. Metal surfaces, instrument readings, the specific demands of re-entry procedure. He was a pilot again. He separated the modules, endured the heat of descent, prepared for landing. Whatever had happened in those minutes above the Earth, he folded it into a compartment of his mind that he could not afford to examine until the ground was under his feet again. The official narrative from this point to touchdown is largely uncontested. The descent was rough but successful. He ejected at the planned altitude. He descended by parachute. He landed on Soviet soil and was met by bewildered locals who had not expected an orange-suited figure to appear in their field. The question that had defined his entire life up to that morning, "Are we alone?" had crossed from the philosophical to the personal. It was no longer something he wondered about. It was something he knew. And within hours, the process of making sure he never fully said so had already begun. The debriefings began within hours of the landing, not the next day, not after rest or medical recovery, or even the basic courtesy of allowing the first human being to return from orbit a few hours to process what had happened to him. Within hours. Engineers arrived first. They asked about the systems, the instrument readings, the performance of the capsule during each phase of the flight. They were thorough, professional, and entirely focused on the spacecraft's behavior. For them, Gagarin was essentially a sensor, the most sophisticated one on board, but a sensor nonetheless, a source of data about how the hardware had performed. The doctors came next. Physical sensations, tolerance of the launch forces, adaptation to weightlessness, the experience of re-entry. All of it recorded with the careful neutrality of people whose job is to transform human experience into data points that can be stored in a file and compared to other data points. Then in the psychologists, these conversations had a different quality. The questions were broader, softer, designed to invite rather than extract. How did he feel? What were his strongest impressions? Were there moments during the flight when his emotional state had been particularly intense? The politeness in the room was professional and slightly too consistent. And then the other conversations. Smaller rooms, fewer people, no recorders visible, though the absence of visible recorders in a Soviet security context was not an assurance of anything. Men who sat across from him and established, early and clearly, that what was about to be discussed existed in a different category from what had been discussed before. In these rooms, according to the reconstruction that can be assembled from indirect references and later accounts, Gagarin was required to produce a written statement describing every unusual observation he had made during the flight. He wrote about the three objects, their trajectory, the way they maintained formation, his assessment that their movement was coordinated, not accidental, the word he apparently used, according to later references to this document, was deliberate. He described the impression, which he did not try to explain away, that they were observing. He wrote about the second episode, the light that surrounded rather than illuminated, the vision of the earth suspended in a lattice of luminous lines, the presence that was enormous in a way that made physical scale beside the point, the understanding that arrived without language and settled, uninvited and indelible, into his memory. Each of these elements was evaluated, discussed and assessed, not by philosophers or scientists in any publicly acknowledged sense, but by committees. Military committees, political committees, the kind of committees that produce conclusions before they begin deliberating, because their function is not to find out what is true, but to determine what is permissible. The conclusion, when it came, was as decisive as it was predictable. The entire set of anomalous observations was classified under a special regime. State secret of extraordinary importance. Any reference to them in public documents was to be removed or rewritten. The radio transcripts were edited to eliminate the relevant segments, a process described in internal documentation as the removal of technical noise. And Yuri Gagarin, the man who had been above the earth when it happened, was informed, politely, formally, with the specific courtesy that institutions use when they are issuing instructions that are not open to discussion, that any deviation from the approved account of his flight would not merely damage his reputation, it would constitute a matter for a tribunal. The world greeted him with a scale of celebration that no individual human being had ever received before, and that no protocol had been designed to manage. Leaders lined up to shake his hand. Children in countries that had never heard of the village where he was born learned to recognize his face before they could write their own names. He was given medals, parades, official visits to capitals on every continent. He shook hands with kings, presidents, prime ministers, and heads of state who competed with one another for proximity to the most famous person on the planet. On paper, it was the highest reward a state could give. In practice, it was a very elegant cage. Under the justification of protecting their greatest symbol from the inherent risks of spaceflight, the system quietly and systematically removed him from the front line of real missions. The argument, deployed whenever necessary, was entirely reasonable. The Soviet Union could not afford to lose its most visible achievement to a training accident or a technical failure. Other cosmonauts could take those risks, not him. What the argument did not acknowledge, though certain internal documents suggest it was understood, was the other calculation underneath it. A man who had seen something that could not be controlled and who had already demonstrated in the debriefing rooms that he could not be relied upon to spontaneously forget it, should not be placed in situations where he might again find himself in a position to improvise, to say something unscripted, to let something true escape into the public record. Cutting ribbons was safe, Delivering rehearsed speeches was safe. Smiling for cameras was safe. Sitting in a cockpit on the edge of the unknown again was not. But cages, no matter how well designed, have cracks. In the years after the flight, in the private spaces that even the most thoroughly monitored public figure occasionally inhabits, a quiet kitchen with a trusted friend, a walk far enough from any obvious recording device that the normal caution temporarily relaxed, certain phrases began to appear in the accounts of people who had spent time with him. He never gave the full account. He never drew diagrams or produced documents or said, in any form that could be directly quoted, "This is what I saw." But the essence surfaced, again and again, in the particular way that truths surface when they have no sanctioned outlet. We are not alone. They are watching. Humanity has already been noticed. Spoken softly, almost reluctantly, with the quality, according to the people who heard these remarks and later described them, of someone committing a small, deliberate violation of an oath they had been forced to take. As if each phrase was the absolute minimum, the smallest possible fragment of the actual thing that he could release without crossing a line he had decided, for reasons of his own, to observe. The system noticed. Reports on his behavior, compiled by the people whose job was to compile such reports, noted philosophical reflections on the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence and tendencies toward metaphysical interpretation of the cosmic experience. The language was mild. The anxiety behind it was not. If the first man in space began to frame his flight as a genuine encounter with something non-human, the ideological architecture built around that flight would develop structural problems. The response was to deny him the one thing he wanted most. He enrolled in a military academy, worked toward recovering his status as an active pilot, studied, trained, gradually, over years, demonstrated that he remained technically capable of flying. For him, this was a return to the one environment where the rules were honest, where the machine responded to his inputs rather than to decisions made about him in rooms he was never invited to enter, where the gap between what he experienced and what he was permitted to say narrowed almost to nothing. For the system, every hour he spent back in a cockpit was a restoration of exactly the risk they had spent years managing. In the weeks before the 27th of March, 1968, there are accounts, none of them official, several of them reported by people who claim to have been present, of Gagarin speaking with an intensity that was different from his usual register. The upcoming flights will be very important. I must understand. The precise context of these statements is unclear. To some, they read like the determination of a man eager to prove that he was still capable of flying. To others, they carry a different weight. The particular resolve of someone who has lived for years alongside an unanswered question and has concluded that they are approaching their last realistic opportunity to pursue it. The 27th of March arrived as an ordinary day on the calendar. The official account of what happened is technically coherent. Gagarin and his co-pilot, Vladimir Seryogin, took off in a jet trainer for a routine practice flight. During the flight, their aircraft executed a sudden maneuver, possibly to avoid another aircraft, possibly in response to changing weather. The maneuver led to loss of stability, an unrecoverable dive, and an impact with the forested ground below. A tragic accident. A sad end to an extraordinary life. A case now closed. But from the beginning, the edges of that account collected details that did not fit cleanly inside it. Witnesses in the areas near the crash site described seeing a bright object in the sky shortly before the impact, something that did not resemble any conventional aircraft and did not move like any known meteorological phenomenon. Their testimonies did not make it into the official report. Those that were recorded were filed under classifications that indicated they were considered unreliable. The teams that reached the crash site in the hours after the impact described burn patterns on the aircraft wreckage that were irregular in ways they could not immediately explain. Radiation readings in the immediate area were slightly above normal background levels, an anomaly quickly attributed to instrument variability. Scorch marks on nearby trees that, when the angles were examined carefully, did not correspond cleanly to the trajectory the official reconstruction required. No single element, examined in isolation, overturns the official version. Together, they form a pattern that returns persistently to the same unanswered question. What was the bright object in the sky? And is it possible, not certain, not provable, but possible, that what Gagarin encountered in orbit 7 years earlier was not, as the classified files described it, a one-time event? His family did not give sensational interviews. They did not write books contradicting the official account. They did not hold press conferences or release documents or speak to journalists about things they had been told or shown or quietly led to understand about what happened during those 90 minutes above the Earth. They maintained, through the years and the decades and the gradual transformation of their country from one system into another, a dignified and consistent silence on the parts of the story that the official version had left deliberately vague. This silence has been interpreted in different ways by different people. Some read it as loyalty to his memory, a decision that the best protection for a legacy already under constant pressure from competing narratives was to not add fuel to any of them. Some read it as genuine ignorance. The family of a man managed as tightly as Gagarin may simply have had no more access to the real account than the general public. Others, fewer in number but not unreasonable in their thinking, read it as something else entirely. The knowledge that any open challenge to the official version would produce not truth but pressure, more pressure. The kind of pressure that institutions apply when their foundational stories are questioned, which is not the pressure of argument or debate, but the pressure of systems protecting themselves. His family knew what happened to people who pushed. They chose not to push. But Gagarin was not the only person who travelled above the Earth and came back with something that did not fit comfortably into the language of the official record. In the years and decades that followed the first flight, other cosmonauts, Soviet and later from other nations, occasionally, carefully, in contexts where they had reason to believe the words would not carry consequences, made references that their training and their conditioning and their professional habits should have prevented them from making. Flashes of light that had no source, objects at distances and velocities that did not correspond to any tracked satellite. Sensations of being observed that pilots, who are not by profession given to describing their experiences in those terms, nonetheless return to when asked directly about certain moments of their flights. Most of them chose their words with the specific, practiced care of people who have spent their professional lives inside systems that reward discretion and punish the opposite. They said as little as was necessary to acknowledge that something had occurred. They stopped well short of anything that could be quoted as a definitive claim. But the pattern of what they said, accumulated across multiple people and multiple years and multiple flights, converges on a description that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Something was seen, multiple times, by multiple people, in the one environment that human beings had never inhabited before the 1960s, and that they have inhabited only partially and with great difficulty ever since. The Soviet state, which publicly ridiculed the idea that unidentified aerial phenomena deserved serious attention, privately catalogued every report with meticulous care. There are references in KGB documentation to a file titled On the Observation of Unidentified Phenomena, a collection of testimonies from pilots, radar operators, and space program personnel that was maintained in parallel with the official position that such things did not merit serious inquiry. Gagarin's name, in the reconstruction that can be assembled from indirect references and partial disclosures, appears in that file more than once. In one of Sergei Korolev's personal notebooks, written not long before his own death, in the private shorthand of a man who had spent his career operating at the intersection of the known and the not yet known, there is a line that has attracted attention from researchers who encountered it in the decades after his death. If they return, we must be ready. The pronoun is ambiguous. It could refer to foreign aircraft. It could refer to geopolitical adversaries in the abstract sense. It could refer to any number of things that a rocket engineer in the 1960s might have reason to anticipate. Or it could mean exactly what it says. This is the honest position from which any serious account of the Gagarin mystery must conclude. We do not know exactly what he saw. Not because the evidence is thin. The evidence, the gaps in the radio logs, the medical observations that don't fit the official picture, the consistent pattern of private statements over years, the anomalies at the crash site, the parallel documentation that was maintained alongside the public denial, is more substantial than the official version is comfortable acknowledging. We do not know exactly what he saw because the one person who had the direct experience of seeing it never gave the full account in a form that could survive the institutional pressure applied to everything he said in public, from the moment he stepped out of the capsule until the moment he died. The testimony was there. It was given, partially, in the debriefing rooms, in the written statements the security services required, in the documents that were subsequently classified and that have since only partially and indirectly surfaced in the public record. What we can say, with the confidence that the accumulated evidence supports, is this. After his flight, Yuri Gagarin could no longer see humanity as alone in the universe. Not as a philosophical position, not as a poetic metaphor for the humbling perspective that comes from seeing the earth from above, as a direct, personal, experiential conviction rooted in something that happened during those erased minutes above South America and in the final moments before re-entry. And that conviction cost him more than anyone around him was willing to acknowledge openly. It cost him the freedom to fly again for years. It cost him the freedom to speak without monitoring. It cost him the gap between what he knew and what he was permitted to say, which is one of the most wearing forms of isolation a human being can experience, and which he carried for the remaining 7 years of his life. Whether it cost him his life as well is the question that the 27th of March, 1968, does not clearly answer. And that lack of a clear answer is itself part of the record. Somewhere above the atmosphere, in the vacuum where temperature and pressure and the ordinary physics of the inhabited world no longer apply, the orbital path of the Vostok capsule has long since dissolved back into the mathematics that described it. Nothing physical remains of that trajectory, but something else remains. The question that Gagarin could not answer publicly, the question that his silences pointed at from every angle without ever stating directly. The question that his private phrases, spoken softly, reluctantly, in kitchens and on walks, and in the rare moments when the monitoring relaxed enough to allow it, circled without landing on. Are we alone? He knew something about the answer. He knew it with the specific, unshakable certainty that only direct experience produces. And the system he served made sure that his knowledge and the account of how he acquired it would not travel freely from his mind into the minds of the people who might have received it. That decision, to classify the experience rather than examine it, to manage the witness rather than listen to him, to protect the narrative rather than trust the truth, says something about us. It says something about the kind of civilization that takes its first step beyond its cradle, and in the same moment, begins building the mechanism that will prevent that step from meaning what it could have meant. Along the invisible orbital line that Gagarin traced on that April morning in 1961, for a few minutes above the dark ocean, the eyes of one human being met something in the dark that was looking back. The fact that we turned that moment into a secret tells us as much about ourselves as any answer about them ever could. If this investigation changed the way you think about what Gagarin saw, if you found something in his story that feels like a question you are not finished asking, subscribe to this channel and leave a comment below. What part of this stayed with you? The erased minutes over South America? The phrase that never made it onto the record? the 7 years of golden captivity that followed, or the crash and the questions it leaves permanently open. Write it. These stories reach further when you share them, and the people who carried them deserve to be remembered by more